Let me read to you a passage from the 18th chapter of St. Luke's Gospel, verses 9 to 14. It's the Gospel for Saturday of the third week of Lent. St. Luke writes, "To some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everybody else, Jesus told this parable. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood up and prayed about himself, 'God, I thank you that I am not like other men, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give 1/10 of all I get.' But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, 'God, have mercy on me, a sinner.' I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted." That's from Luke chapter 18, verses 9 to 14. Among other things, it speaks to us of the role, the importance of the conscience. What do I mean? Well, there are many things, of course, that distinguish man from the animals, and many things which both have in common. The common definition that man is a rational animal acknowledges one major difference between the two, man's rationality, and places this in the context of the many things he has in common with animals. Man is an animal with rationality. But his rationality is not the only difference. Many would place just as much emphasis on his religious character. He acknowledges God or the gods, and this pervades his life. Another difference, part and parcel of his rationality, understood broadly, is that man has a conscience. An animal has no idea of right or wrong. So when an animal attacks and kills a human being, it is not tried in a court of law and sentenced to prison or death. It is not executed, but rather it is put down. The animal cannot help itself. It is driven by its instincts and has no sense of what should be done. The animal is not blamed, whereas its owner might be, or those looking after the animal reserve, or any other human beings who overlooked something in wildlife management, or the tourists. Allowing for some aberrations, all men have a conscience, which is to say, a sense of right and wrong, which to a greater or lesser extent they translate into practical judgments and decisions. Man is aware that there is such a thing as right and wrong, that he should do certain things and avoid others. He is also aware of the numerous times he has failed to live according to what he knows to be right. He has a guilty conscience. But there is another important factor or feature of this common element of conscience in man. The sense of right and wrong seems to lead very many people to the thought of God. Our conscience, telling us to do this or that, includes in its dictate the sense that it is the echo of a voice within, or yet beyond. A voice within and yet beyond. Now, while the analysis of this is, well, tricky and elusive, by and large people have the sense that the conscience is sacred, ultimate, and vaguely the voice of God. If one were to say that this is an illusion or a mere manner of speaking, well, at the very least this would be saying that, as we say, 40,000 Frenchmen are wrong, and that there is no authority in the voice of mankind. Cardinal Newman, in his sermon notes, published sermon notes, has one entry for July the 22nd, 1864, his sermon notes for the Pharisee and the Publican, And in those he comments on the prayer of the publican and its admission of sin. He writes that in the appeal, "God be merciful to me, a sinner," there is contained the essence of true religion. The words of this prayer refer to the conscience leading a person to God. He says that all men have a conscience, that is, a consciousness of right and wrong. And he refers to the second chapter of Romans, verses 14 to 15. But in some, it does not lead them, when they transgress it, to God. They are, rather, angry with themselves. They know they are wrong, and they are distressed, but it does not lead them to religion. At the utmost, it leads them to understand a sin against their neighbours, such as cruelty, etc. But when it leads the soul to think of God, then that soul may be very sinful, but at least it has something of true religion in it. That was his comment. Now, what this comment of Newman's suggests is that while all have a conscience, which includes a sense of guilt, their religion will turn on their readiness to perceive in this an echo of the judgment of God. The instinct of conscience is to accept this in some sense, but other considerations can lead a person quietly to reject the thought. So then, the thought of a living God is within the reach of everyone, and that thought is contained in the dictate and feeling of conscience. The publican of our parable today gives a picture of the proper and healthy functioning of the conscience. He had done wrong, and his conscience made him aware of it. He instinctively understood that his sense of guilt manifested the judgment of God. As a result, he raised his mind and heart to God, asking for mercy. In his sinfulness, the publican represents mankind. In his acknowledgement of sin before God, and in his prayer for pardon, he shows what the conscience can do for man if it is interpreted aright. It can lead him to God. Due to the blessing of conscience, his own conscience, the publican prayed in the light. He saw his true situation, which was that of a sinner before God. He was able, with head bowed in the presence of God, to appeal for mercy. The conscience was his friend, for it took him in his sins before God. By contrast, the Pharisee, who was also a sinner, had gradually blinded his conscience, which God places in us as our friend. Let us not fear to examine our consciences regularly, indeed daily. If we have no sense of guilt, let us fear lest we be somewhat like the Pharisee. If we do have a sense of guilt, let us acknowledge this, but in the presence of God, which our conscience will also tend to suggest to us. It is not difficult to pray the prayer of the publican, and our conscience is our friend in the doing of this. Cardinal Newman once famously called the conscience the aboriginal vicar of Christ. That is to say, it is the representative of Christ within our very nature, bringing us to him who is the one who takes away the sin of the world. Let us treasure the prayer of the publican in our gospel today. It should be, if our conscience is functioning properly, easy to pray. It will take us to God.